Thank you, Michael. That was amazing. My name is Maddie Williams, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Sarah Arthur, Sarah with an H, is a fun-loving speaker and the author of a dozen great books on the intersection of faith and great literature. Her most recent is award-winning A Light So Lovely, the spiritual legacy of Madeleine L'Engle, author of A Wrinkle in Time, which we have for sale downstairs. She has recently been hired as co-director of the first annual Madeleine L'Engle Conference happening in New York City this November. She served in youth ministry for over 20 years and absolutely loves it, but she'll be just fine if she never eats pizza from a box again. She lives in Lansing, Michigan with her 2 little boys, Micah and Sam, and her husband, Tom, who is a pastor at Sycamore Creek Church. Today she'll be speaking about her story and the importance of creativity in Grownups.
Okay, I'm a storyteller, so this is going to be stories about my life. I hope that's all right. It hasn't been a format so far. Thank you, Michael, for being awesome. That's not intimidating at all. I graduated from Wheaton College in 1995. I don't even think you were like a flicker of a thought in your parents' minds yet. Maybe you were, maybe you weren't. And looking back, I was an English major, and looking back at the mid-90s, I realized it was a really sweet time to have a degree in the humanities. Like, it was pretty stable, okay? Like, maybe it was just illusory and I was oblivious, but it felt pretty stable. The economy was pretty stable, I think. Like, I think we can say it was pretty stable. There was this tech boom because the internet was brand new, and we didn't know it was a tech bubble that was going to burst. We just thought this is awesome. And then there was this housing boom that we thought was amazing, and that turned out to be a bubble that also burst and tanked all the economy, and that's why you're all panicking right now as you look at your majors. But that hadn't happened yet. So we were all chill about all of that. And then, the terrorist attacks of 9/11 hadn't happened yet. And the first of the major school shootings, the mass shootings, which was at Columbine, hadn't happened yet. And all of these things, even health insurance wasn't super duper expensive, okay? So like all of the things that make you guys and your parents for your whole life so far super stressed out about an uncertain future just were not in the water and in the air yet. And again, maybe I was oblivious, and I'm sure there were lots of people who were suffering and struggling, but it was totally, at least within the circles I ran in, potentially okay to go home at spring break and tell your parents, yeah, I'm thinking about switching from business to drama. What do you think? And there wouldn't be this sort of like bald panic on their faces, like, honey, have you thought about this? There wasn't that. So you could be an art major, you could be an English major, you could do drama, you could do all of these things, and in a few weeks, you could go home and tell your parents you were switching majors to something that was not really highly employable, and nobody panicked about that. At the same time, there was still this subtext, yes, that you probably needed to have a backup plan. Okay, like you maybe wanted to have something else in mind in case writing novels didn't work out. And so you were encouraged, if you were an art major, right, that you also got a business degree. Do we have double majors in the room? Somebody was raised, yes, okay, right. So that's your contingency plan, right? Like if this doesn't work out, then this other thing. And if you were an English major, you wanted to get a degree and just add it, what would it be? Secondary education or something else employable, okay? We have, yes. So whatever it would be, you would add something as your contingency plan. And that was the subtext. There wasn't a lot of panic about it, but it was probably a good idea. So I did. I added Christian education as my other highly employable major, question mark. And so, but I thought that was a pretty good gig. My dad was a pastor, so I knew the church thing, and I could figure that out. But also, I have this really deep love for intercultural ministry. And that was something you could that was a track for Christian Ed back then. And so I really had a passion for those who were on the underside of power and people who were struggling and suffering. And I really wanted to be involved in places where God was doing amazing work there. In fact, for Christ and his kingdom is the motto at Wheaton, and we were all going to change the world, right? We were all going to go out there and be involved in saving lives. Never mind that job was already taken. We just thought, this is what we were going to do. So I had a double major. But deep down, once I took on that second major, I was grieving that I would have to get rid of doing some of the things that really gave me joy, that I really loved to do. You know, when you were a kid on a Saturday morning in your jammies, like my 5- and 8-year-old have been, or on snow days or ice days, of which we've had an ungodly amount in my household lately, you get to do whatever you want. And for a lot of us, it was, for some of us, it was sports, but for some of us, it was writing or drawing or creating plays or, crafting or whatever it was, those things that just gave us joy, and we had leisurely hours to do all that. And we thought if I could be a grown-up and get paid to do that, that'd be amazing. And as an English major with a double major in Christian Ed, I was grieving the idea that when you get to be an adult, you probably have to give that kind of stuff up. Have you kind of had that worry in your life before? Like, I'm not going to get to play drums, and I really love to play drums. I don't. But some of you might. And when is that going to ever happen again? Right? I was deeply grieving that. But I was also more deeply concerned about having to go live with my parents after graduation. And so I got this other major. And then when I graduated, I went and lived with my parents. They were so kind, they're so loving, they're wonderful, but I'm glad it lasted for a very brief window of time. I interned at a newspaper, and then I read the classifieds, and there was a job for a youth director, and I was like, oh, I bet I could do that. I don't know a lot about teenagers. I recently was one, so maybe I could do that. So I got a job as a youth pastor. I can't verify this, but I'm pretty sure, historically, I was the first ever English major to become a youth pastor. I can't verify that, but I'm pretty sure it's true. It's not the usual career path, okay? Like a lot of us end up in libraries, and we don't ever raise our voices. And I had to be a youth director where I was like, listen up! And that was so weird to me, and there were a lot of things I didn't know how to do. I couldn't play basketball. I could play guitar in the key of D, with like 3 chords. And thankfully, a lot of praise choruses in the 90s are all in the key of D. Lord, I lift your name on high. He has shown thee. Oh, you can just go from like one to the other in the key of D. Thank God, because that's all I had. And I didn't know anything about paintball, which turns out is really painful. That was on-the-job training for me. I didn't know any of these things, but turns out I actually love teenagers. I had a great time with teens, and I really love to teach them the Bible. Everything that I had learned in my lit classes, I just like leveraged all of that for studying the Word. All of those words in literature, and then you're into the Word, and I really loved that. And I write a pretty spectacular church newsletter, not gonna lie. All of my training in creative writing, these were works like Pulitzer Prize winning material, guys. They were read by like maybe 2 people, but hey, they're somewhere out there, my body of work in church newsletters. I was really good at that. But along the way, because I had let go of the storytelling side of me, the literature-loving side of me, the side of me that wanted to write fiction and poetry, I had not balanced that very well. Like, you can actually hang on to those loves and be in church ministry, and I did not know how to do that. I did not know that it was actually okay. It wasn't like a conversation, killer to tell people that you like reading Dostoevsky in your spare time. Like that was something that I did not know how to do. And youth ministry in itself is a burnout machine, unless you're really careful, and I was not really careful. And in addition, there were these amplified crises in my church's life, including the suicide of our senior pastor. I was 22. I was the only remaining pastoral staff at that church. And when you add up all of these things that begin to crush your soul over time, you begin to burn out. And I began to burn out. And it was year 3 And I was like, I don't know how I can keep doing this. It was year 4. I don't know how I can keep doing this. Year 5. I don't know how I can keep doing this. And what is so weird is that when you're in the job of changing lives and saving souls, you think, but I'm doing all the right things. Like, this should be amazing. This is what we're here to do. All my parents, my grandparents are so proud of me. This is why we went to Wheaton. This is what it's all about. And here are these souls that are waking up to Jesus, and mine is dying. Something is wrong. Something was wrong. And the longer I was in that role, the more I felt like I was sinning against God by not doing what he had made me to do. It was so hard. Here I had a real job, and my soul was dying. So I quit. I went into my pastor's office, my third pastor by that point, in year 6.5, and I sat down and I said, this is not sustainable for me, and it's probably me. It's a temperament thing, and I feel like I'm missing some skills that are really important for thriving here, and I've carried a lot of burdens here for a long, long time, and I need a break. And this was at the beginning of a school year, and the pastor said, okay, let's plan for a planned exit at the end of the school year. Guys, it was one of the most beautiful transitions of any church ministry transition that I've ever heard of. It was planned. We got the families and the teens and the church and everybody ready for that transition. They were able to be interviewing and hiring somebody in the midst of that. And I was able to exhale and know that, you can endure anything if you know when it's going to end, right? And so then I was done. And my soul needed space to be restored and renewed. And so, bless my husband, who also worked at the church at the time, he and I planned together that I would be able to take a break from having to work at all for 6 months. We worked that out financially so I could do that. And you know what happened? I would wake up like it was a snow day, in my jammies. I would drink some coffee, and I would write, because that's what I wanted to do. And I would wake up the next day, and in my jammies, like it was a Saturday morning, and I would draw, if that's what I wanted to do. And I needed time to do that, to be restored, to understand who it was that God had made me to be. I had no real job prospects. I was writing some curriculum for some publishing houses, which gave me publishing experience. But at a certain point, I went off to a writing conference, and I met an editor there. And she and I struck up a correspondence. She was from a major Christian publishing house. And this is less than a year after I had finished my youth ministry job. I pitched her an idea. I pitched her an idea for a youth devotional book. Yes, I knew all about teenagers now. A youth devotional book about spiritual themes in The Lord of the Rings. So this was when The Lord of the Rings were in theaters, back when I would have been your favorite babysitter. And so The Lord of the Rings, the very last movie, was coming out in theaters, and I had this idea, and I pitched it to her, and I had no what's called platform now, if you've heard of that, like where you have a presence out there in the world. Social media wasn't a thing, so if they had mentioned Twitter, we'd all been like, yeah, the birds are really talking a lot today, aren't they? So I didn't have any of that. I was a failed youth worker, and they still gave me a chance, and my platform was Frodo, and I just rode that elevator all the way up, somehow, magically, by God's grace, and had a bestseller in Christian publishing a year after I quit youth ministry, feeling like a failure. It was a bestseller in Christian publishing. Guys, it is super trippy to see your name on a list with like Oswald Chambers and C.S. Lewis and Rick Warren. And I was like the flunky youth worker on that list with all these other amazing people. And this was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. And I went on to keep writing books about the intersection of faith and great literature. I wrote about Tolkien and The Hobbit. I wrote about C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia. I wrote about Jane Austen. I wrote about Madeleine L'Engle, is my most recent book, the author of A Wrinkle in Time. So that intersection of faith and fiction has been my shtick. And actually, right now, I get to be the preliminary fiction judge for the Christianity Today Book Awards. So I read all of this fiction that's being published and select some that are going to go on to final judges to be the winners. But in all of that, despite the fact that I was reading these artists who kept saying that we are made in the image of a maker, that the mark of the maker upon us is that we want to create stuff, I still kept putting off writing fiction, which was my first love. Now, when Walking with Frodo came out in 2003, I started a novel. And I would chip away at it periodically. But for me to justify being a writer, nonfiction felt more like adulting to me than writing fiction, right? Like we keep using all of these reasons why we have to stick to something that pays the bills. And my nonfiction was paying the bills, kind of, sort of. Thank God I'm married to somebody who also has a job. Even with all of these amazing examples, I could not justify in my mind how fiction was putting a roof over anybody's head or feeding any mouths or helping orphans or any of the things that weigh heavy on our hearts all the time about a hurting world. I went off to the Calvin College Festival of Faith and Writing. I don't know if anybody's been there. It's basically like going to Hogwarts. It's so amazing. So I went off to that, and I go every other year when it happens. And one year I went, and Catherine Patterson was speaking. I don't know if you know who she is. She's the Newbery Award-winning author of Bridge to Terabithia, and Jacob Have I Loved, and The Great Gilly Hopkins. And she gave this talk, and I remember nothing about it, just like you won't remember anything I say right now. I remember nothing about it. I've heard her give the same talk twice, and I still don't remember anything about it, except for this one sentence. And it was sort of this throwaway line where she said, "I want to be a spy for hope." And I thought, that's amazing. I have no idea what it means, but I'm going to write it down. So I wrote it down, and I remember thinking, like, this is awesome. This is going to be my motto, whatever it means. And I, like, underlined it and circled it and starred it and drew unicorns around it. I was like, this is so great. I want to be a spy for hope. I felt like I'd been given the piece to some puzzle whose picture I didn't even know what it was supposed to be yet. And yet I hung on to it. My husband and I, shortly after my book started to take off, decided that we were sensing a call for my husband to become a pastor. So we went off to Duke Divinity School in Durham, North Carolina, where he got an MDiv, and I eventually got an MTS, a Master's in Theological Studies. And that, for me, was going to be a jumping off point to getting a doctorate in practical theology. Note the practical in that. Like, I still had this thing, like, it's got to be practical. And I have yet to ever get a doctorate in practical theology. I started having babies later, but that's another story. So we were down there, and while we were in part of this community, we began to worship at a historically black church that had been deeply involved in the civil rights movement in Durham. And out of that came connections with people that were living in intentional Christian community on the northeast side, which was, at the time, like the most known residences of gang members in the whole city. And so we moved into a household with other Christians that were practicing radical hospitality to women and children that were in the midst of transitions out of homelessness or into homelessness, and we were trying to be the stopgap for that for some of them. These were not people in super duper crisis. These were people who had jobs but just needed a leg up for a time to be with us. And while we were there, 3.5 years, for a good portion of that, I was writing, I was a student, and I kept pushing my fiction to the side. You know that novel I'd started? I kept just pushing it to the side because it was even more amplified in that setting, how superfluous it felt like to be working on art when people needed so much help. Now, we had a person in the house, her name was Grace. Of course, her name was Grace. I'm not making this up. Her name was Grace, and she was a former narcotics abuser. She was coming in off the streets to live with us. She was about as different from me in race and class and life story and background as anyone you could ever picture. And we somehow became friends. And Grace was my buddy because I worked at home and she was sick a lot. Her body had just taken a beating for so many years. So we would hang out. And so I'd be working, and she'd be bored because at one point she had surgery, and her recovery was endless, and it taxed all of the energy in our household. And it's really hard for people who are super busy in school and work like we were to like pause and like try to give attention to somebody who's bored out of their minds. Because we're like, how could you possibly be bored? We are all like running crazy here. But she was bored, and so she had gone through every DVD that we had in the house. at a certain point. And finally, I went down the hall from my room to her room with my only DVDs that I had, which was all the extended versions of The Lord of the Rings, which is like 40 hours of material. So I walked down the hall, and I'm like, okay. I give her all these caveats. It's high fantasy, which if you don't like that thing, this will be sheer torment for you. A lot of white dudes running around. Not a lot of female characters to relate to. I mean, I guess there's a giant spider, but whatever. So good luck, okay? And she was like, okay. So she pops it in, and the movie keeps going. I can hear it down the hall. I can hear the soundtrack by Howard Shore, that famous award-winning soundtrack, and for hours. And then the next day, I still hear more Howard Shore, and it's going on. And I'm realizing, she's into the second movie. She must really like this. And then she's into the third movie. I can tell. I've got it memorized, guys. And I was like, wow, she must really like this. So at a certain point late in the day, I come out of my room, and I know exactly where she is in the final movie. Like, okay, bear with me, those of you who know nothing about Lord of the Rings or Tolkien for a moment. Just the rest of you can be like, yes. So I know that the Fellowship is at the gates of Mordor, and they're trying to distract Sauron from where the hobbits are attempting to bring the Ring of Power and throw it into Mount Doom. Like, I just know exactly what's happening. I hear Viggo Mortensen go, "For Frodo!" And then the hobbits run forward, and all the armies clash, and there's this huge climactic noise coming from down the hall. And then there's that high soprano, if you know what I mean. There's that, like, ah, which always happens when help is on the way in a soundtrack, okay? Ah! And I knew that at that moment, the wizard Gandalf had seen that help was on the way. And all of a sudden, from down the hall, I hear Grace yelling, "The eagles are coming! The eagles are coming! Thank you, Jesus! The eagles are coming!" And I thought, I get it. I get it. I get why I get to live here in this household with a woman named Grace. Of course her name is Grace, who is showing me that in this place, it's possible for stories to bring hope and joy in the midst of great suffering, that far green country that we long for, that Tolkien talked about in The Lord of the Rings, that in that moment, I was there to be a spy for hope. And she was teaching me how to do that. I was there to be a double agent. That my job was to look for where God was already at work in that place, and then to take that hope and to fashion it into something, to create it into something, to craft it into something beautiful and holy and full of joy and lament and boldness and the glory of God, and give it back to the world. That is what art is. That is why I'm here. I was to be a spy. And that is what you get to do. Those of you who are grieving right now, that maybe you're going to have to give up the things that you love because you're going to have to get a real job. You get to be double agents. That's what I want you to do. Then when you're out there paying the bills, when you're out there getting a real job, when you're out there adulting, what I want you to do is that I want you to hold all of those things. I want you to take from that, look for the joy, look for where God's already worked, look for the hope, and I want you to take that, and I want you to fashion it, and I want you to create it into something beautiful, something holy, something difficult and wonderful that brings you joy and lament and points to the glory of God and gives him praise, and I want you to give it back to the world. I don't care if it's a film short or a song that you're writing or playing drums at your church on a Sunday morning or drawing art in your spare time or waking up on a Saturday morning, because yes, this is Grownups, eventually someday you will get to do that. In your jammies, you're doing something that you love to do because you love to do it. I want you to be a double agent because you were made in the image of a maker who made you to make things, and that brings him glory and that brings hope. My husband is now a pastor at a church in Lansing, Michigan. We have two beautiful little boys who get up in their jammies on a Saturday and a snow day and do whatever they want to do, and I don't shuttle them around to many thousands of activities. That's not our house at all. I'm a volunteer in the youth ministry. I'm the most overqualified, experienced volunteer of any youth ministry anywhere. I've done a lot of that, and I don't eat pizza out of a box, like ever. But everybody else can, that's fine. I just published my 12th nonfiction book, a biography of Madeleine L'Engle. And 10 months ago, I was diagnosed with stage 1 breast cancer. That's why I have a hat right now. It was actually 6 hours after I turned in revisions for my book about Madeleine. And it shattered the illusion that I'm in charge of whatever this story is. Like, all of a sudden, it didn't really matter that I needed a job that made me employable. Like, who cares? Because there are other things that are important. All of the bald primal panic that I probably should have been feeling in the mid-90s when I was doing my English major, I suddenly felt. It was embedded in my body and in the cells of my existence. And you know what I did? In between all of my surgeries and chemotherapy and all of the crazy, horrible things that happen to your body when you have a diagnosis like that, I was writing the novel that I'd started 15 years ago, and I finished it. Finally, 15 years later, I understood that this is what I needed to do. I had it printed and spiral bound and gave it to my long-suffering husband for our 21st wedding anniversary as a thank you for sticking with it, for telling me it was okay to write fiction, which he did year after year. Because I realized that in that moment, I wasn't just needing to be a spy for hope for other people. That a lot of what you're going to do when you hang on to those things that you love is bringing hope to yourself. Thank you.